Hello and welcome to lecture number 2. The actual video lecture that I promised would be available to you this week. I hope you enjoyed the essay that was lecture number 1 related to Linton Park's The Burial. I had a lot of the research that I focused on over the past 3 years has sadly been heavily related to death, dying, and mourning in the 19th century. And literal history, but a work of art in a museum, the Taubman Museum of Art in Roanoke, where I was working at the time, really struck my eye, caught my attention. And it was a simple portrait of a woman and a child. And the title of the painting was Jane Eleanor Sherman Lacy and Her Son Edward by Lily Martin Spencer. Well, this painting had been interpreted by the museum as simply a portrait of a mother and child. At best, it reflected 19th century gender ideals about domesticity and how a mother and child would relate to one another. Nothing really too deep had been really explored with that particular work. But several pieces of important symbolism caught my eye and suggested that the painting had another secret, a hidden meaning behind it. And so through my research, I started to look at this symbolism, and I found that the painting was actually painted in 1857. I was able to date the painting and show when it was painted, and I showed that it was a post-mortem painting. And what, of course, that means is simply that the portrait was done of the sitters after they had died. And it was meant to memorialize those individuals. I've included a couple of links that you can check out through Blackboard in the student links section that you'll find that can give you more information about this research. Of course, it predates the period that we're examining in history. That's part 2, really, of our nation's history, of American history. So I'm not going to go into too much detail now with that painting, but this led me to investigate the culture of death in 19th century America. And that's what helped me better understand the burial, which did relate to, or does relate to, the period of history that we've been exploring. Because if I had not understood that culture of death, many of the visual clues that are found in the painting, The Burial by Linton Park, would not have suggested that something else was going on in that painting, that it indeed was not a burial, but was an exhumation of a Union soldier. So, I just wanted to share some thoughts about death and dying and mourning during the 19th century because, it's really been a fascinating subject. For one, it was extremely popular in the 19th century. And of course, this goes back in history several hundred years to have post-mortem paintings done or completed of deceased loved ones. An artist could easily depict the image of a deceased loved one in the form of a painting, possibly in a brooch that one could hang around one's neck in order to memorialize the deceased loved one. And this was just simply a wonderful way to preserve the memory of those we loved. With the advent of photography, really in the 1840s, it became increasingly popular, not necessarily to turn as often to artists, to fine artists, to painters to create those images of loved ones. It became more common to start to turn to photographers to come in before the body had been buried and to take a picture, a photograph of the deceased loved one. To us, this is very macabre. It's somewhat disturbing even. But this was extremely popular in the 19th century. It's still done today even, but much more in the 19th century during the Victorian era. And so this would be a way that you could have a much more realistic image of the individual to preserve their memory. Well, death and dying was something that was very much a part of Victorian culture. Infant mortality was extremely high. It was around 40% during the 19th century. So meaning roughly 40% of children would die in infancy due to disease. If a family had several children, it was almost guaranteed that 1 or 2 of them would have died in infancy. And so death and dying was important to this culture, and that's why there was such a strong visual symbolic imagery that was associated with death and dying. For example, wilted roses in a portrait would indicate probably that the painting had something to do with death and dying and mourning. But with death and dying being so important, being such a part of the home even, it was something that just simply was a part of life, much more than to our culture in the 20th and 21st century, where we've done so much to keep death at bay. If someone is sick, they go to the hospital. That's probably where they'll end up dying, in the hospital, or possibly in hospice care, or possibly in a retirement community of some sort, but not necessarily in the home where they lived. In the 19th century, you were generally born in your home and you died in the home. And so a particular room in the home was used as a viewing area for the dead. And this, of course, was the parlor. If someone died in your household, a family member, you would lay them out in the parlor and visitors would come by and pay their respects. You would typically wait 3 days to bury the individual, somewhat for some religious reasons and such, but also there was a strong desire to make sure that there were signs that decomposition was setting in. Because one of the greatest fears during this period in history was not so much death, but was actually being buried alive. Now, Edgar Allan Poe would tap into this theme in the early 19th century and become quite popular with his macabre stories about individuals being buried alive. But he was simply one of many individuals who was tapping into this genre, into this fear that Americans, and Europeans for that matter, had. It went so deep in the culture that there were actually security coffins that were designed, where the coffin would involve the person having a string tied to their finger, the deceased body or allegedly deceased body, a string tied to their finger or maybe their toe. And then they were buried in the ground, and the string would go up through a tube to a bell that would hang above the grave. The bell would be encased so that the wind couldn't blow it. And if you woke up in your coffin, deep beneath the earth's surface, if you could muster the strength to ring that bell, to wiggle your finger and ring that bell, it would indicate to people patrolling the graveyard that you had been buried alive and they were then to dig you up and save you. Of course, these individuals listening for these dead ringers, as they were called, and yes, that's where we get that particular term, dead ringer, they would, of course, many times hear the bell if it happened and run off because they were afraid. These individuals that worked in these graveyards to listen for these bells, when they worked at night, it was known as working the graveyard shift. And that's where we get that term as well from this particular practice. Well, if the individual showed signs of decomposition in the parlor, it was clear the individual was deceased, then of course a funeral would take place. But increasingly, as the 19th century moved on and as the 20th century began, it became much more in vogue now in American culture to take the body out of the home and place the body in a funeral home or funeral parlor, with the word funeral parlor referencing the room in the home that was so associated with death and dying. These individuals would now be placed on display outside of the home, and that's where individuals could go and pay their respects. Now, by the 1920s, it became increasingly unpopular to refer to the room in your home that was known as the parlor as the parlor. There was a strong connotation with death within that room. And so what better way to purge the home of death than to rename the parlor? And that's what Americans did by the 1920s, roughly. It increasingly became popular to refer to the parlor as the living room. And that's why we have living rooms in our home today, as a way to purge death from the home and ensure that the home is no longer associated so strongly with death as it was in the 19th century. So that's just a little bit about some of the interesting tidbits of information that's been related to some of my research over the past 3 years, looking at a postmortem portrait, which again you can learn more about by finding the links through Blackboard, and then also, of course, my work with the burial. If you ever have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me. I look forward to continuing to work with you this semester. Have a good evening, or a good day, or good morning, whichever the case may be. Take care.